What's good, YouTube? Steel here, and this past weekend consisted of a huge tournament with $10,000 in cash pricing, which brought out the best of the best as 2,829 players gathered to participate in this event, thus making it the largest tournament in Pokemon Pocket history, probably in the history of a lot of different games. But nonetheless, there's no better way to analyze the state of the meta than breaking down this tournament. Before we begin, if you're a fan of anything and everything Pokemon Pocket, we post everything from weekly meta reports to Master Ball rank gameplay and breakdowns, as well as expert solo battle guides. So whether you play the game competitively or casually, there's something for you on this channel. So please consider subscribing, as we're getting ever so close to 500. Without further ado, let's get into this week's meta report, and above all else, stay pro. 3 weekends into the Celestial Guardian meta, and we continue to see a shift. And I wouldn't be surprised if we continue to see a shift in the meta due to like the results of the tournament. But this graph and chart isn't about the results of the tournament, just about play rates. And it being the biggest tournament that we've seen in Pokemon Pocket, and it might be the biggest tournament we will see for like God knows how long. Players came with everything they had, repping decks that are either viewed as the best or meant to counter the best. Thus, we see a clear increase in play rate of both the most consistent deck in Giratina Darkrai and last week's tournament winning deck, the Giratina Greninja with Tapu Lele, as each reached almost 20%, which in like simpler numbers, both decks had over 500 like players using it. But I believe it was fair to say that although these numbers seem insane, they were expected. But it was like the Decidueye Meowscarada that actually was a little bit more surprising to me, as it jumped from 3% all the way to 10% of the tournament play rate. But it also kind of makes sense because it's a known counter to these decks. The top 5 is rounded up by Arceus Crobat and Giratina Greninja with Oricorio instead of Tapu Lele, which have both become less popular but are definitely strong choices in the current meta. I myself participated in this tournament with Arceus Crobat with Carnivine, but was out of the tournament by round 7 through a combination of just like poor play and less than ideal hands, but no excuses. So I personally believe I actually brought the wrong deck. If I were to like redo or like could go back to Saturday, I probably would have played, funny enough, the Greninja Oricorio list. It has been my most successful deck in ranked as I'm recording this, and if you are interested in what list I'd run or the gameplay in general, I've actually posted a video on it, which I'll add a link to in the description, so feel free to check it out after this video. And despite the top 5 taking over more than 60% of the competition, the rest of the tournament included some heavy hitters that performed very well in this tournament, including but not limited to Garchomp, Stoke Charizard with Incineroar, and Magnezone Oricorio. Due to the insane amount of players, Topco was actually top 128 after 10 rounds of Swiss, but after almost 3,000 players battled it out for hours, it all led to this, which is actually far more significant than you may realize. Meowscarada completely dominated the Swiss rounds and made up over a quarter of the top cut. Meanwhile, right behind it was Giratina Greninja with Tapu Lele, as they combined to make over half of the top 28, top 128. I'm not even used to saying that number. It's crazy. However, these were strong decks that were highly represented, so success was not like out of the realm of possibilities. But the biggest surprise to me, for at least for me personally, was the drop in percentage of Giratina Darkrai. And personally, it might be due to like over preparation almost, like since like they respected Oricorio so much. I feel like a lot of them were on the Komala or whatever it's called, and honestly maybe that left them a little more vulnerable to some of these matchups that maybe day to day they would have been able to like defend. However, as you can see here, it dropped, although it seems like a slight number, right? From 20% to 15%. But when you see the success rate that Giratina Darkrai has had over almost like 2 months now, a month and a half almost, seeing it drop rather than increase and it becoming like the third deck rather than the top. And as we go further into the video, you'll see like win rates and stuff. It was actually like very surprising that how poor it performed. The top cut, however, was truly top heavy, as the only other 3 decks that had more than like 2 representatives in top cut was Garchomp, Arceus with Crobat, and Oricorio Greninja. Every other deck had either 2 players or less like representing it. So as you can see, despite like it being top 128, there was only like truly like 6 or 7 different decks that like truly made it. The other ones were like one-off players sneaking in. That's not to take away of neither the player nor the deck they were using, as that didn't stop Magnezone Oricorio's miracle run, as it proved that not only does it have great matchups against Giratina Darkrai and decks like Charizard, but also had a favorable matchup against Meowscarada Decidueye, thus being in the perfect position to succeed, as its best matchups made up almost 75% of like the remaining players in top cut. But the best way to see how and why it did so well is by jumping into my favorite part of the video, where we break down win rates of some of the top performers and determine if their performances are sustainable or just like a lucky run. Looking at the winning deck list of Magnezone Oricorio, we could see that the deck is pretty standard. They actually added Shaman, which is almost like adopted from the Oricorio Greninja list. At least in my personal opinion, I saw it a lot in Magnezone Oricorio. I've never really seen it in this build. However, the winner clearly used it. It helps with like keeping up with like the pinging from whether it's Tapu Lele, whether it's Darkrai, opposing Greninjas, anything that's like dealing damage to you. Although Shaman doesn't heal it fully, it does like help you keep up with that. But what I like to look at is not just like the one performance that did well. I want to look at every Magnezone Oricorio throughout the entire tournament, so we get a better idea of how the deck competes against most of the meta. Here we have it placed against the top 5 decks that aren't itself, and as you can see, as a whole, regardless of the opponent, they went for a basically 50% win rate, which doesn't translate to like, oh, this deck is crazy good. It's basically it wins half of its games, it loses at the other half. But where it did dominate is the fact that against, as you can see, against Meowscarada Decidueye, it had over 70% win rate. And what ended up happening is like the winner went against in top 128. So think about it, it had to win 8 rounds, I believe. Half of them were Meowscaradas, and I don't know whether it's that Meowscarada over prepared or the fact that it could only hit Magnezone for 60, but which is probably why. Magnezone out damages Meowscarada, as well as Decidueye can't get hit by Decidueye can't hit Oricorio, so it becomes like this weird like back and forth. It's sort of how like Greninja Oricorio beats the Meowscarada matchup, where you just like let your Meowscarada loses a lot of potential once there's no EX on the other side, and Magnezone took full advantage of it. Meanwhile, surprising to me, it barely had over 50% versus other decks, and it got completely crushed by Arceus. Like the fact, I guess, that Arceus was hitting them with Crobats or Carnivines, depending on like the version, is something that Oricorio couldn't keep up with. Magnezone was probably getting sniped left and right, but when I saw that it barely won over 50% against Darkrai, that's when I was like, truly, I don't know if this deck would be able to repeat unless Meowscarada becomes like super popular, which is possible. I don't see a performance like this happening consistently. However, it's still a very good deck, and as you can see, it performed well. 50% is better than under 50% that we will see later on in the video. But as far as like a winner goes, it definitely was like a right place, right time sort of situation. But regardless, congratulations to the winner. That prize pool is like something that I wish I could have gotten, honestly. I didn't perform. Like I mentioned earlier, I played Arceus Carnivine. But regardless, that's what my takeaways from this list is. Does very well against the counter to the main meta decks. And for some reason, it's like 50-50 against the rest. It could also happen that the Koala was doing a lot of work in these matchups. Maybe if Darkrai players start dropping the Koala so that they have better matchups against the non-bird decks, this deck gets even better. Who's to say? I guess we'll talk about it next weekend in the next meta report. So let's jump to the second deck I want to talk about. Runner-up and probably the most impressive deck this past weekend had to have been Meowscarada Decidueye. Mainly the version, as you can see here from the list that I posted, the one with Dartrix. Something about having like the middle, the stage 1 in the deck made it like either more consistent or like less susceptible to like red cards and Marses, I guess. Like since you were able to see, like you don't have to depend on just rare candy. Also, like being able to build up either line with rare candy and not having to hold, I don't know. There's something about playing that stage 1 that really made this deck feel more powerful. Although their stats kind of got crumpled up, bundled up in Limitless. So I can't really tell you like which one was Meowscarada without the Dartrix and which one was. But I'm actually kind of glad that they mixed them together because on paper they're essentially the same deck. But yeah, if you're gonna try a version, I would suggest the one with the stage 1 of the Owl as well. But nonetheless, if you look at these stats, it's just insane. Yes, the win rate is 54%, which is honestly on par with my win rate in ranked. Honestly, I wish it was higher. I'm being full transparent here. Between trying different decks, between learning how to use certain decks and stuff like that, my win rate kind of hovers there around 53-54%. And honestly, the best performing deck having that rate makes me feel a little bit better about myself. But nonetheless, that's not what we're talking about. We're talking about the fact that against the top 3 decks, and this, when I say top 3 decks, I'm talking about play rate and performance. Like these are the top 3 decks in Top Cut. And Meowscarada Decidueye had over 60% win rate against Tapu Lele, Darkrai Giratina, and Garchomp. So like Garchomp saw a lot of a rise in play rate due to its ability to counter the Giratina list like Tapu Lele and Oricorio list, just because it's able to hit around the bird. However, it completely got stomped by the other counter to the meta, which was Meowscarada, making Meowscarada kind of feel like it's in a point where has it become so anti-meta that it became the meta? That's how it feels anyway. And as you can see, the numbers are insane. Yes, it struggled against Arceus Carnivine, mainly because like Crobat plus Carnivine, like if they see their Exodia hand, they're one-shotting everything that you have in front of you. If they hit you with a red card and you don't evolve fast enough, they definitely take over. And then it had like a 50% win. That Oricorio is not the Magnezone one. The Magnezone definitely crushed this list, but there wasn't enough Magnezones in the tournament for me to make that comparison. But against the Greninja Giratina with Oricorio, Meowscarada kind of held its own.
unlike with the Magnezone version, when there was, again, if you remove the EXs, this deck starts to struggle a bit. As long as the other deck has an EX, you kind of have a fighting chance, except, I guess, for Arceus, right? The third list I wanted to break down was probably what I believed was going to be the best and strongest deck for this event, and clearly I was wrong as you look at the stats. Greninja Giratina with Tapu Lele. I guess like its claim to fame was the fact that it did win last tournament, but I believed it was going to be played so much that it would like make up for any flaws it had. But clearly a lot of people caught on to like either how to counter it or how to play, or if they even had an option, because like as you can see, it had almost a 60% win rate against Arceus. So like Arceus decks couldn't really counter it or couldn't find a way to really stop it. And same thing with Greninja Oricorio. In head-to-head matchups, unless the Oricorio version is playing like double Arida and sees more healing, or it's almost like a race to Greninja. Personally, I now that I've played both sides, I feel like it's almost like whoever knows what they're doing will win more than the other. But if both people know what they're doing, whoever has more healing tends to win. Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe I haven't played the matchups enough. But as you can see, in tournament play, Tapu Lele definitely has the benefit over Oricorio, regardless of how I feel. The numbers are the numbers. But overall, the deck only won 50% of its games, and as you can see, and it's a huge sample size. As you see, it's like over 1,700 games won, over 1,600 lost, but its matchups against the top 3 decks, based on not only play rate but making the top cut, was abysmal. Under 40% against Decidueye, just under 50% against the Darkrai, which is supposed to be like the deck it was countering. As you can see, it's closer than we thought. Whether that's because of the Koala, or whether it's just people, now that they know what Tapu Lele is trying to do, are a little more like protective of where they put their energy, or how they are a little more careful how they place their energy. And then Garchomp just completely wipes you. Like placing down a Giratina against a Garchomp is just like punting the game. Like you auto lose when you do that, but then you don't have a way to win if you don't do that. So it's kind of like awkward, as you can see by the win percentage being just over 30%. And when out of 10 games you're only winning 3 of them, that's just horrendous. So I was honestly wrong about Tapu Lele. Once I saw it, I thought this like, oh, this deck's insane. Granted, in practice, the reason I didn't take it to the tournament is because I didn't feel comfortable. And personally, I thought it was my fault. I thought like, oh, maybe I'm not good enough, and that could still be true. But nonetheless, the numbers kind of back up what I was feeling, where it's like, I feel like I can't win some of these matchups. And I guess more people than I thought felt that way after it had like that miracle run where it won. It barely made it into top 64. Shout out to Amistido. He definitely got that well earned. Well, the whole being able to switch up the energy is also huge. Maybe they have to play around that a little bit more. Maybe there's more matchups where you actually want the water and not just pure psychic. Personally, I don't have enough testing with the deck to claim what the right way to play it is, but I do look forward to see any innovation that they do, or if it just completely falls off after this poor performance against the top decks in the meta. Deck number 4 that I wanted to break down is almost like a fan favorite, and also a favorite of mine to like bash on for some reason. I feel like every week I'm bringing up Charizard just to say like this deck is not good. However, I had to bring it up because in Swiss there was a player that went 10-0, and I was just like dumbfounded. I was like, how are they doing? Like, this is crazy. Like, I even like the list wasn't anything crazy. I basically had almost an identical list in like my decks in the game, and I was like, I gotta try this. And as soon as I booted up, I bricked in the mirror, and then I faced an Oricorio, and I was like, how did this man go 10-0? If you look at their gameplay, like their 10 rounds, they dodged Oricorio completely. They didn't have to deal with one, and that goes a long way. Outside of like, honestly, full transparency, this is a deck that loses only to itself more than Arceus. Like if you see, and that's obviously ignoring Oricorio. If you dodge Oricorio, the only thing you can lose to is not seeing your rare candy into Charizard early enough. If you see it early enough, there's very little to nothing other decks could do. As you can see by the numbers, essentially it's a 50%. Like, did you see it or did you not? And then the only time that you have like a better win rate is against Decidueye Masquerada, where you have the type advantage. However, that's all to say that this deck has like sort of how like I felt like Garchomp had a good chance to do well in this tournament, due to the fact that that Tapu Lele was doing so well, since it was a direct counter to the Giratina decks. I feel like Charizard might see the same result, where it still sees play and will see success in tournaments because of how many players might jump on the bandwagon that is Decidueye. And again, only time will tell. We'll see clearer next week when we do a meta report of that. But for the time being, Charizard continues to be underwhelming in my opinion. But there is upside in the fact that it counters one of like the better or the most played decks, and it's only going to get more play. So we'll see. The fact that it's 50-50, basically 50-50 across the board otherwise, leads to it having a chance. Like, it's one of those decks from even like the Genic Apex Charizard, when that deck would pop up here and there in formats. It's just a deck that loses only to itself. So if somebody has a lucky run or is on fire, you'll see stuff like we saw this past weekend where somebody went 10-0 in Swiss. And that's basically all I have to say about Charizard.
last but not least, I had to break down the most popular deck for like past month and a half. Even in this tournament, it was the most played deck, despite the numbers, like the results not being where it wanted to be. Overall, ultimately, it was lists that weren't using the koala. Basically, the Charizard mentality where like, I'll play hoping not to see the bird, and that would be my best chances. And ultimately, it was their best chances until it wasn't. So yeah, the most successful decks were the Darkrai Giratinas until they started seeing the Magnezone list and just got knocked out. I feel like the lists that were doing even like having more susceptible to losing were the ones using the koala and just not going against decks that were requiring it. Like I guess they were like basically giving up some of the advantages and consistencies that they have against other decks in the format, like Meowscarada, for example, that saw so much play, that naturally counters you, and the fact that you have like the chances of drawing this dead Pokemon that doesn't do anything for you did not help at all. Same thing went for the Tapu Lele, because the Koala can't even like block in the front for a while because Tapu Lele just skips right over it while they build up a Giratina or Greninja. Poke just Cyrus out the target that they actually want to take care of. So for the first time, if it's not the first time, I have to like look back at it to confirm. Giratina Darkrai averaged less than 50% and by a significant margin, and it was just getting crushed. Like the Oricorio Greninja list, as you can see there, was winning 60% against Darkrai, and it's a lot of yellow and a lot of red. The only matchup where it was Darkrai was continuing to farm just like the week prior is Garchomp. Garchomp really struggles against Darkrai Giratina, but is now struggling much more against other decks in the format. If the majority of the players, because there was over 500 players playing it, I can't tell you how many were on Koala or not, because it's like I'm not gonna go through every list, and I don't have like Limitless doesn't offer that, at least to my knowledge. So maybe if players start shifting away from the Koala and just playing like this standard build that did the best in this tournament, we'll see better performances against throughout the metagame. But only time will tell. Hopefully this means that Giratina and Darkrai is finally out of like the eyes of the top. It sees less play and we see like a more diverse meta. Although diverse meta is kind of a headache in its own right, because like the more diverse it is, the harder it is to pick like the right thing for something like this, like tournament, or you go into ranked and every game's something different. So like you might see your bad matchups 5 times, or it's really hard to like pinpoint. So there's like a good and a bad to formats like this one. Although I do prefer formats like this than formats like the prior one, where ranked was just like a bunch of Giratina Darkrai mirrors, or actively playing something that counters Darkrai Giratina. And it wasn't even a counter, like, because Gyarados had a good matchup, but not because it was a counter, it just hits hard enough. And if you have enough capes and stuff, you don't lose, but you could also brick on Magikarp and would lose. So like, it's like, what do you prefer? It becomes like personal preference. Honestly, diversity has its good and bad. Regardless, I'm just excited to see Giratina Darkrai get knocked off the top, and hopefully it stays that way. But again, we'll see more, have a clearer picture next week where we see how people react to these results. And that does it for like the breakdowns. However, I did want to finish up the video with a few honorable mentions. Decks that didn't see enough play for me to do the same, like deep dive into like their matchups. However, decks that performed well, and I'm excited to see if people take it to tournaments in the coming weeks and seeing how it continues to succeed or not. Maybe I'll even take it into ranked and see that. But as you can see here, we have Gengar Tapu Lele, a deck that personally, full transparency, I lost to in my second round of the tournament. I was not only was I not prepared for it, Tapu Lele is just a very hard counter to Arceus decks as a whole. But as you can see here, it's a pretty standard like anti-meta-ish deck. The Oricorio serves as like a Marshadow. I don't want to go too much explaining it because it would be like not like BS, but like I haven't piloted it myself. I just had to like show props to the deck, as well as Gallade Rampardos, which is another deck that on paper I could see what they were going for. However, again, not enough play for me to determine how well it does against specific decks in the meta. But I see what they're going for. Gallade is a strong deck that sort of like Togekiss variants. Anything that attacks with just 2 energy and is a stage 2, and be able to cheat that out with Rare Candy is something that most decks might not be able to deal with. The 170 HP is very respectable. Lily being able to heal it is huge. And then always, it's similar to Garchomp decks, having that Rampardos in the background just to swing for 130 is pretty strong. Granted, you can't search the fossil and all that. That's why you have cards like Iono. Honestly, there's a very high ceiling for Gallade, but also like I wonder how it goes. Maybe it'll do better now that that Darkrai Giratina might fall off a little bit, because the issue with Gallade is that it doesn't deal enough damage to a Darkrai Giratina list if they're like ready for it, if they see it. Gallade might continue to see play, and if Darkrai Giratina falls, I could see this climbing even further. However, Giratina is going to be all over the place, so I don't know where this deck will go. I just felt like the fact that it topped in such a big tournament, and I made it all the way to top 32 if I'm not mistaken, is something that I had to point out. And last but not least, I wanted to shout out Meowscarada Beedrill, because it was the way, like if y'all weren't playing when Shiny Revelry dropped, the first like top that Meowscarada did was alongside this Beedrill, and it was not with it wasn't with Rare Candy. It was sort of just like hard going into Beedrill, the 1/1 line, while focusing on Meowscarada. it was almost like fun to see it come back. I can see where it's coming from. I can see like the upside to it, as well as like not really. It counters some similar to the same decks, but again, once again, like the other two decks I've honorably mentioned, there wasn't enough like people on it for me to compare how well it does. Obviously, it has a great matchup against Darkrai with the ability to hit with weakness. If you find Beedrill fast enough with the rare candy, you could lock some decks out from even being able to attack. But ultimately, it didn't. It also, I believe, went top 32. But again, not enough for me to determine whether it was a lucky run from this one player. Congrats to them regardless. Or if the deck actually has potential. I'm a big fan of playing both Beedrills in order to be able to counter the crazy bird. But nonetheless, a deck that performed very well, and I just had to shout out. With that said, I hope y'all enjoyed a little deeper perspective into the results of the largest tournament in Pokemon Pocket history. I post a meta report like this every week, and if you want to keep up with the results are really telling, like the stats and all the breakdowns that I do, feel free to subscribe so y'all stay one step ahead of your opponent. Best of luck on either your next tournament or the rank ladder, and above all else, stay pro.